Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the book.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on March 3rd, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, before we get into this week's Astro news, you can use my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at KarmicEvolution.com, clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast, and from there you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent show, and or search the archived listings for past shows that you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And a quick reminder that the show now drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen then or anytime after. And while you're there on that page, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about exactly what each of us, depending on our specific sun sign, needs to be happy. And as I've mentioned numerous times, this is based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely in the name of promoting astrology and its effects on our lives. And yes, downloading this freebie will also sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, feel free to unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcasts, content, and other astro news you can use. I usually post, but not always weekly. And I'm posting also on Instagram under karmic .evolution. So feel free to follow me there as well. Thanks. All right, and finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute, it's an hour and a quarter, Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, and that's an offer for radio show listeners only. So if you're interested in, or I should say podcast listeners, I have to update my, I've been doing this actually, I think the middle of this month, it'll be 5 years that I've been doing radio shows / podcast. So if you're interested in this reading because you're interested in astrology and you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, plus you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires, especially within your areas of greatest interest, whether that be relationships, career / job, finances, and or your health, then this is the reading for you. So we'll look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime may be keeping you stuck now in old habitual patterns, or what I call conditioned behavior, and how better understanding this conditioned behavior that leads to old habitual patterns, which are not conscious, that this knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness using astrological insight to do so, well, that's easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so now let's get into this week's Astro News you can use. I'll point out that the monthly lunar cycle's waning still, and this may be reiterative of what I said last week, since the Pisces new moon conjunct Saturn in Aquarius from February 19th and 20th, calls us still to continue to commit to the hard work of visualizing a concrete, manifestable plan for a better future. And that would be one that includes both Aquarian principles of equality and the Piscean notion that we are all connected as one. So first, let's look back at some of what's occurred earlier this week, leading up to today, and until we reach next week's Virgo full moon and Saturn's ingress into the sign of Pisces on March 7th. First, we had the waxing monthly cycle's first quarter Gemini moon square to the Pisces Sun on February 27th, which provided us the energy to grow toward initiating that Pisces new moon Saturn mission to plant seeds of commitment to world peace and a better future for us all. Of course, I'm talking in collective terms, but understand that peace, inner peace, is really what this is all about, so we can look at it on an individual basis as well. And next we had the much talked about, much touted everywhere on social media, Venus-Jupiter conjunction in motivated Aries on March 1st or 2nd, depending on your time zone, which provided us the initiative to help bring together partners and groups in the name of expanding peaceful and harmonious relations. So what did we see as a result of these energies in the world collective? China made overtures to both Russia and Ukraine to broker peace talks between them, something it announced on February 23rd and 24th as those aforementioned aspects were waxing in strength. And China, according to the Associated Press in a report dated February 23rd, quote, called for a ceasefire and peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky cautiously welcomed Beijing's involvement, but said success would depend on actions, not words. Now remember, the sun is in Pisces at this time. Beijing claims to have a neutral stance, this article goes on, in the war that began 1 year ago, but has also said it has a, quote, no limits friendship with Russia and has refused to criticize Moscow's invasion of Ukraine or even refer to it as an invasion. It has accused the West of provoking the conflict and, again quoting China, fanning the flames by providing Ukraine with defensive arms. I believe that the fact that China started talking about Ukraine is not bad, Zelensky told the news conference, but the question is what follows the words. The question is in the steps and where they will lead to. Again, this leads back to that seeds that were planted at the Pisces new moon conjunct Saturn. I need to know that there's a commitment to action if you're going to propose something that will make the future better. Meanwhile, we also saw overtures by Emmanuel Macron, France's president, who, according to the New York Times on February 25th, again as we're waxing into the first quarter square, quote, says he will visit, this is from the New York Times, says he will visit China and praises Beijing's efforts on a peace plan. President Emmanuel Macron of France on Saturday called Beijing's engagement in peace efforts for Ukraine a good thing and said that he would travel to China in early April. Now, despite a tepid Western response to a peace plan that China proposed, Mr. Macron was firm in supporting those efforts. This is, again, still from this New York Times article. China must help us put pressure on Russia so that it does not use chemical or nuclear weapons, and so that it halts its aggression in Ukraine as a precondition for any peace talks, Mr. Macron told reporters in Paris, end quote. And then we have, of course, last week's announcement by President Biden at the Pisces new moon. It's almost now 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, the new moon conjunct Saturn, of the commitment of $2 billion in additional aid to Ukraine and an increase in sanctions in Russia. And I mentioned this last week. But as we approached the Venus-Jupiter conjunction in Aries, which occurred late March 1st and early March 2nd, again, depending on your time zone, and Mercury's conjunction to Saturn in Aquarius March 2nd, remember this follows the new moon in Pisces, Sun conjunct Saturn, right? So Mercury now has caught up and is conjoining with Saturn as well, which happened yesterday on March 2nd. We might note also that Saudi Arabia pledged to send $400 million in humanitarian assistance to war-torn Ukraine, a commitment hailed as an important one a year after Russia launched its invasion by John Kirby, spokesman for the U.S. National Security Council. Meanwhile, also, as we wax toward Mercury's entrance into Pisces yesterday, March 2nd, and the Venus-Chiron conjunction today, March 3rd, we learned that although many are by now skeptical about China's offer to broker a peace plan between Russia and the Ukraine, and that Russia's Vladimir Putin has essentially dismissed this as a viable possibility, that according to today's March 3rd New York Times, and here I quote, Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken said during a visit to Uzbekistan on Wednesday, which was yesterday, that the Biden administration, 2 days ago, that the Biden administration saw zero evidence that President Vladimir Putin of Russia was prepared to engage in serious peace talks over his war in Ukraine, despite growing calls for such actions and for such talks to start. To the contrary, the evidence is all in the other direction, Mr. Blinken said, adding, the real question is whether Russia will get to a point where it is genuinely prepared to end its aggression. So I want to point out again that this was after, or as, Mercury conjoined Saturn in Aquarius on March 2nd, and we learned from the Washington Post that the same Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State in the Biden administration, spoke briefly with Sergei Lavkov, the Russian ambassador, who wanted, because Blinken said he wanted to disabuse Moscow of the idea that the U.S. support for Ukraine might be waning, and reiterated that the United States would provide military and economic assistance for, quote, as long as it takes. So clearly we see all of this, commitment happening, first again at the Pisces new moon, and now again as we're waxing through we waxed through the first quarter lunar square and approached these Venus Jupiter Chiron conjunctions between March 1st and March 3rd, which is today, that the Venus Chiron conjunction perfects at this morning on West Coast time, and about 12:48 right before this show dropped, in Eastern time. So here's some of the things that we've witnessed about commitments by allies partnered in solidarity with Ukraine, but also signify wounds to our value systems and our sense of justice as Venus waxed toward her conjunction to Chiron today. So, we know too that since this aspect was waxing, as Mercury entered watery, vague, spiritual, artistically creative, and visionary Pisces March 2nd, that, such wounds that are now coming to the surface because Chiron's involved now in the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, helped many to obscure, deny, or otherwise ignore the Russian-Ukrainian conflict as if it's not real, which is to say that there are those who've convinced themselves, after supporting Ukraine for the past year, as Russia has waged its brutal war not only against Ukrainian soldiers, but against average citizens as well, by indiscriminately bombing their homes, their schools, and their hospitals, that this conflict no longer concerns them. So inherent in this is the idea that elongation of this conflict has wearied people to the notion that supporting Ukraine over Russia is no longer in their best interests. And to the U.S. Congress, as well as others who are supporting Ukrainian efforts to oust the Russians from their land, from other countries, particularly European countries, this is, of course, related to funding. So remember, Venus conjoined Jupiter in Aries. They no longer see the fight as a worthwhile one that demands expanding the amount of taxpayers' dollars on. So instead of this being termed an ideological battle of Cold War proportions to keep an aggressor, read Russia, from expanding its authoritarian rule, many are turning away and claiming this war, quote, has nothing to do with us. So there's an awful lot of Piscean energy in that claim, as Mercury's March 2nd entrance into the sign of two fish swimming in different directions illustrates. So, we know that, and I mentioned last week, Mercury remains in Pisces until March 18th or 19th, when he enters more motivated Aries, and the Sun moves into Aries at that point as well. However, of course, so, the point here is that we've got people, exhibiting one part of the Piscean fish going in one direction, and the other part of that archetype going in another direction. So, I'm pointing out that some want to swim back to source and hide and deny and not get involved, and it isn't me and not in my backyard, and all those kinds of less motivated or assertive actions, I guess, not wanting to take motivated and serious actions. But we can note, of course, that Mercury can also be far more empathetic, which is to say it can feel others' pain more acutely. Now, it's that ability to feel others' pain that is really representative in the archetype of the two fish yoked together, but attempting to swim in different directions. When the pain is too acute, some people want to escape. And when the pain is felt acutely but motivates us to take action, then the fish wants to swim out into life and to do something to help those who are either weaker emotionally or less fortunate. So again, it's interesting to note that combined with Venus, right, values and finances, and Jupiter, excuse me, and I'm talking about the fact that Mercury entered Pisces on the same day that essentially that Venus and Jupiter conjoin. So if Venus means values and finances, and Jupiter expansion, largesse, and of course the law, that their union in a sign ruled by Mars, whose mission, like I said, is to defend and protect those too weak or otherwise incapable of defending themselves, that, we also saw this week many things that relate to, people continuing to support the Ukrainian battle against the Russians. So right now, today, let's note that Venus conjoined Jupiter at 12 degrees and 8 minutes of Aries on March 1st or 2nd, then conjoined Chiron, wounded healer Chiron, at 13 degrees 58 minutes Aries on March 3rd, as I just described a little earlier before this show dropped, and that all three are basically considered conjoined right now in Aries between 12 and 14 degrees. Therefore, looking at the Venus-Jupiter conjunction solely from a positive point of view, which I mentioned before, the Jupiter-Venus sightings have been all over Facebook and Instagram, people taking pictures and talking about them as they got closer and closer together and hailing them as this great time, because it's the lesser and the greater benefic both coming together, but without mentioning the chironic angle and then interpreting this trio or this stellium as bringing out wounds to these archetypal energies. I think that's somewhat remiss, at least in my opinion. So as we just saw, the Venus-Jupiter conjunction resulted in an expansion of monies pledged by groups. That's the Mercury-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius on March 2nd, and Venus-Jupiter, right? But where has it shown us in greater relief how there's been an expansion in other relationships, again, Venus, that align with the archetypal meanings of both Jupiter, read, religion, higher education, travel and immigration, philosophy, etc., foreign cultures, and Aries, which represents at its basic anything from motivation and assertion to aggression, violence, and war. Now, one of the things that I note is that this week the Supreme Court heard arguments about the Biden administration's plan for student loan debt forgiveness. And I think this has raised wounds around justice and equality in terms of higher education, not to mention the fact that the impetus behind Biden's, I'm not sure if it was an executive order, but their attempts to allow for student loan debt relief was based on the fact that there were many shady student education loans made by many shady loan companies with exorbitant interest rates. We've all seen stories, if we have decided to be aware of this issue, where people are still paying off debt like 40 years later, right? And yes, it kicks up wounds for a lot of people here because some object to the debt relief for younger students now because they didn't get it before. But those who took loans 40 years ago, it's hard to say. I mean, presumably that was a time before the loan companies got so greedy and people had to pay more or higher interest rates. In any case, it's interesting that we also saw this past week with the Venus Jupiter Chiron stellium in Aries a change in religious values as Venus, Jupiter, and Chiron travel together in Aries this week. So let's not forget again that Chiron is the wounded healer. Thus, when in conjunction with Venus, he indicates that our past or current values may be wounding to us now. And likewise, conjunct Jupiter, Chiron can show us where our faith has been wounded. So again, it's interesting that we also saw this past week this change in religious values, and a perfect example of that, as these aspects were waxing, is the evangelical and priests and Catholic priests' announcement, which it's actually, there's some of the evangelical community. This is the Lutheran community. This was reported on Daily Kos, which, yes, is an arm of the Democratic Party, a news arm, on February 23rd, again, as we approach the first quarter monthly lunar square after that new moon, and now we're waxing into this Venus-Jupiter-Chiron conjunction this week. So the quote is, Lutheran leader calls for excommunication of white nationalists. The leader of the second largest Lutheran denomination in the U.S. has taken a strong stand against white nationalists. As Religious News Service reports, and this again was printed in Daily Kos, that's where I saw it, but they're quoting the Religious News Service. And here's the quote, the president of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has called for the excommunication of unrepentant white supremacists in the church's ranks, rebuking an extremist effort to exert influence within the conservative Lutheran denomination. In a letter dated February 21st, LCMS President Matthew Harrison said he was, quote, shocked to learn recently that a few members of LCMS congregations have been propagating radical and unchristian alt-right views via Twitter and other social media, end quote. But the article goes on, he noted far-right members were causing local disruption for congregations and alleged that LCMS leadership and deaconesses have fallen victim to online threats, some of which he described as serious. And then Harrison went on to say, this is evil. We condemn it in the name of Christ. And in a strange way, this goes hand in hand, kind of, with MSNBC's Chris Hayes, who has a show on MSNBC, some of you may watch, using Christian rhetoric by saying that the GOP's original sin is that they have never, quote, repented for the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2021. So Hayes goes on to say, and I quote, the original sin here, not to use overly Catholic terms, is Trump and the enabling of him and what he meant for this country. And the fact that the majority of this House Republican caucus voted for the first ever violent coup in this country, and when they came back into the chamber with the glass broken and the blood on the carpet, and a woman who had been shot and killed, and several others who died trampled, and cops concussed out on the street, they came back and voted with the mob for the coup. That has never been repented for, and it's never been apologized for. It's never been redeemed in any way. It is the sin that haunts all this, and I feel duty-bound to point that out, but that's the thing that is there, that is it, end quote. So I just thought that was extremely interesting, all the use of the religious terminology in, one from a religious person and the other from a news person. And in terms of past martial aggression being atoned for, as society recognizes the wounding it's caused, again in relationship to these aspects that have occurred this week, I believe these astrological energies combine to result in this March 1st announcement, as was reported in the New York Times, that, and here I again quote, New York City has agreed to pay $21,500 to each of hundreds of demonstrators who were penned in by the police in the Bronx during racial justice protests in 2020, then charged at or beaten with batons, according to a legal settlement. The case concerned roughly 300 people who were arrested on June 4th, 2020, in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx during protests against the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers the week before. His death set off protests across the country, including in New York, where thousands of people demonstrated in May and June. On June 4th, the police boxed in hundreds of protesters who had peacefully gathered on 136th Street and then prevented them from leaving, a practice known as kettling, according to the lawsuit. If a judge approves the settlement filed in federal court late last Tuesday, the amount would be one of the highest ever awarded per person in a class action case of mass arrests and could cost the city between $4 and $6 million. Now, lawyers for the demonstration, this is still according to the New York Times, described the settlement as historic. Venus, Jupiter, anyone? Venus, Jupiter, Chiron, anyone? They said that before this agreement, the highest amount paid per person in a case of mass arrest was in 2010, when a federal judge awarded $18,000 per person to demonstrators picked up in a mass arrest during a 2000 protest near the World Bank and International Monetary Fund buildings in Washington, D.C., in a $13.7 million settlement, end quote. All right, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk for a few, again, about the Hygeia-Pluto conjunction, which at 29 Capricorn, which is perfecting today, March 3rd. And while I spoke about this conjunction last week, and that it occurs at an anaretic degree, or the last degree of zodiacal sign. I didn't mention that Hygeia's orbit, which is approximately 5.5 years, meaning that's how long it takes to orbit the sun, and how theoretically then, and knowing that Pluto's orbit around the sun is elliptical and not circular, which is why he spends more time in certain zodiacal signs than others. We notice we're coming up to Pluto ingressing into Aquarius on March 23rd, where he's going to spend 20 years, unlike him spending, a little over 10 when he was in Scorpio. So we can guess that these two meet up, that's Hygeia and Pluto, somewhere around every 5.5 to maybe a few more years on average, depending on the cycle of or the orbit of Pluto at that particular point in time. So my point is that this conjunction isn't a once in a lifetime occurrence, but still, given our recent experience with COVID-19 and the prediction of more such viruses in the future, it's an interesting cycle to contemplate. Meanwhile, it's interesting, too, to note that this aspect has been waxing at the same time as the Venus-Jupiter-Chiron one, and we saw this in the Washington Post, which ran on March 1st. And this is the headline: Millions could see cuts to food stamps as federal pandemic aid ends. Now, I had mentioned that, and I believe that's supposed to occur on May 11th. But this article goes on to say, quote, a federal pandemic program that provided extra money to Americans who receive food stamps ended on Wednesday. Oh, okay, it ended already. Threatening to complicate the finances of an estimated 31 million low-income people while grocery prices remain high. And that, of course, is due to the current inflation rate. The article goes on, for some households, the cuts are expected to reduce their monthly benefits by an average of $182, according to the U.S. Agriculture Department, which manages the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program known as SNAP. That means federal aid may provide families an average of only $6 per person each day for food, starting Wednesday, less than what many anti-hunger experts say is necessary for a healthy diet, end quote. So this will undoubtedly put more pressure on our healthcare system in the long run, especially when we remember that Uranus is still in Taurus and changing the way we value our body's needs and the need for sustenance, whether that sustenance is in the form of literal food or in taking care of our body and by association our brain and its association with our emotional natures. And then there's this also from the New York Times, also from March 1st. And this is a more positive piece of news at the Hygeia-Pluto conjunction, or leading up to it. Eli Lilly said it would cut the price of insulin, capping the monthly out-of-pocket cost of the life-saving drug at $35. And it comes after years of mounting criticism from Americans who have said the drug should be more accessible. And this said that the company was taking action to, quote, help Americans who may have difficulty navigating a complex healthcare system that may keep them from getting affordable insulin. So insulin, as many of you know, is a life-saving drug that is usually taken daily, and that has grown increasingly expensive in recent years, and many diabetes patients ration their medicines or discontinue them because of the cost. More than 30 million Americans live with diabetes. And this, again, comes after years of mounting criticism that's led to lawsuits and legislation. Also, last year, the U.S. Congress voted to cap the cost of insulin for seniors on Medicare at $35 per month, but the GOP united against extending that cap to anyone under 65. So Eli Lilly's announcement is huge news for the 37.3 or 38, we have different numbers here, but million Americans with diabetes, 11.3% of the U.S. population, according to the CDC, which also notes that this includes the 28.7 million people already diagnosed, of which 28.5 million are adults, and the remainder children. Now, these statistics come from the CDC. and also the 8.5 million people, or 23% of adults, who are undiagnosed. So those considered pre-diabetic total a whopping 96 million Americans aged 18 years or older, or again, 38% of the adult U.S. population. And for those 65 years or older, 26.4 million, or 48.8%, have pre-diabetes, according to the CDC. Now, some of these statistics can be a little confusing, but let's just say if you're talking about 96% of the American population being either diabetic or pre-diabetic, and there's 330 to 340 million people in this country, that's a pretty big statistic. That's approaching 1/3 of all Americans. Finally, I just wanted to add something that I saw in the local New Jersey news yesterday, March 2nd, which is that Stop and Shop stores have removed gallon-sized jugs of Acadia spring water from its New York shelves temporarily, quote, out of an abundance of caution, because the water is bottled near the site of a hazardous Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, on February 3rd. And the article goes on, concerns continue not only about local drinking water, as chemicals are feared to have seeped into the ground and numerous tributaries to nearby rivers, but also that these waterways may spread the chemical benzene to other states as well. Now, I'd mentioned in an earlier podcast Erin Brockovich's description of these chemicals in an interview she did with MSNBC as creating possible damage because they might spread far beyond Ohio waters. So let's just pause for a minute and note now the use of the word chemical as we await the ingress of Saturn into Neptune-ruled Pisces March 7th. And remember as well that Neptune rules gas and chemicals, or the types of things that you cannot see, and it also rules poisons, because these things that we breathe in, we cannot see them, so we cannot avoid breathing them in, and they can poison people, animals, and the environment if they've been unleashed in destructive ways or for destructive purposes. And we might recognize, too, that we're obviously on the brink of Pluto's ingress into Aquarius, which, as I mentioned before, occurs on March 23rd, and Aquarius is an air sign. So the planet Pluto, for those who don't know, was discovered in 1930 and is often equated by astrologers with the development of the atomic bomb, which was used by the Americans for the first time in Hiroshima, Japan during World War II. So it doesn't take too much imagination to recognize the symbolism here of both these ingresses happening at roughly the same time, and the potential rise in fears that chemicals, particularly those that become either airborne, read Aquarius, or waterborne, read Neptune Pisces, can do vast damage to all living things if released recklessly. Okay, and let me mention just one more thing, which I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't, concerning these aspects, Hygeia Pluto and the wounding of the Venus-Jupiter conjunction, is that, and this is according to NBC News, although it's been reported very widely, that Iran is probing deliberate poisoning of schoolgirls across the country. And that's after a wave of new cases were reported this Wednesday, after officials said the mysterious incidents may have been deliberate attacks designed to prevent girls from seeking an education. And so they're investigating the poisoning of hundreds of schoolgirls across the country that they feel might be in retaliation for girls and young women playing a prominent role in the protests that have rocked the Islamic Republic over the past few months. And that had to do with the young woman who was murdered by Iranian police when she was taken into custody because she had strands of hair showing from under her hijab. Now, this says that more than 100 students were also hospitalized in the northwestern city of Ardabil, which is a strong Taliban hold place. and that the poisoning occurred from some kind of chemical compounds. And so again, we have the connection too to Saturn. Well, the Sun and Mercury currently in Pisces, but also moving towards that Saturn in Pisces ingress. It says, there's a quote here that says, "It has been revealed that the chemical compound used to poison students are not war chemicals. The poisoned students do not need aggressive treatment, and a large percentage of the chemical agents used are treatable." But still, it's a large number of girls, and this is says schools in at least 10 to 15 cities have been struggling to cope with poisoned students. So poisoning cases were also reported at some 30 schools across the country, and that's according to the Associated Press. So anyway, I just wanted, as I said, not to let that go by unnoticed. Okay, so let's move on now into the future, as the Pisces Sun sextile to Uranus and Taurus on March 6th can help us to be alert, quick-witted, and open us all to changing our current perspectives between now and then. This aspect can also provide opportunities to more clearly understand the Virgo full moon's March 7th call to release our attachment to fantastical thinking and any frustration, irritation, or righteous anger, any illusions of that sort may have caused us up until now, when that full moon occurs at 16 degrees and 40 minutes of the Virgo-Pisces polarity at 4:40 a.m. Pacific time and 7:40 a.m. Eastern time, again on March 7th. And since Saturn enters Pisces only an hour later, this calls us to release believing only what we want to believe or what we want to hear or what we want to see, rather than being open to learning and accepting the factual truth. And that's because this Virgo full moon demands that the Pisces Sun drop its unsubstantiated, unverifiable, often fantastical claims and bring back into the equation substantiated, provable facts. Now, the detail-oriented, analytical, archetypal nature of the Virgo moon wants proof from the Pisces Sun, which has a tendency to lack clarity, speak in metaphors, and obfuscate or respond, "I can't recall," when pressed on the witness stand. Ergo, the Pisces Sun's tendency now to remain vague or less than clear in its communication, especially since the messenger god Mercury is transiting through Pisces now as well, is evident as the Virgo moon reflects the Sun's own light back to it now. It shows the Sun its shadow side at every full moon. So it's no surprise, as we've now experienced again, the Venus, Jupiter, Chiron, and Aries, pointing to what's wounded us vis-a-vis these zodiacal archetypes, and that we've also been hearing a lot as we approach this Virgo full moon square to Mars and Gemini about several legal issues that deal with the distortion between facts and or outright deceit and truth. So first, we learned recently that the court has denied Fox News' request for dismissal of the Dominion lawsuit against it. This is the case which claims that Fox News consistently, repeatedly lied about information that it knew it was false because, quote, it's what their listeners wanted to hear. Now, I had said on last week's podcast that I thought people were going to start to get angry at being duped by fantastical stories about things like election fraud as we approach the Virgo full moon, which, of course, is waxing at that lunation into a square. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's not exact at the lunation, but to the Mars and Gemini. And now I believe it's pretty clear that the Virgo full moon's waxing revelations have begun to show themselves, especially since February 27th's first quarter lunar square, as certain facts have begun to come to light just as the first fruit begins to appear on the vine at the first quarter of the lunar cycle. So in addition to learning this past week how many Fox News anchors knew their interview guests were lying and thought some of them were outright crazy, and that's from their individual texts to each other and to others at the company, we also learned yesterday that the U.S. Justice Department has deemed that Donald Trump can be sued to be held liable, potentially, in court for the actions of the mob that overtook the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And that was announced yesterday by the DOJ. And here is a quote. It says, "Speaking to the public on matters of public concern is a traditional function of the presidency, and the outer perimeter of the president's office includes a vast realm of such speech," attorneys for the Justice Department Civil Division wrote. "But that traditional function is one of public communication. It does not include incitement of imminent private violence," end quote. Further, we learned yesterday, too, that the House Ethics Subcommittee will investigate Representative George Santos, that's Congressman George Santos, who's a Republican from New York, who has admitted to fabricating large swaths of his biography and who has been accused of breaking campaign finance laws. So the Washington Post reported that, quote, "According to a statement Thursday from Ethics Committee leaders, its members voted unanimously to establish an investigative subcommittee to look into a litany of claims about the freshman congressman, including about his past business practices, campaign finance expenditures, and an allegation of sexual misconduct against Santos," end quote. So again, as both luminaries approach their squares to Mars, and the moon is going to perfect its square to Mars less than 12 hours after the March 7th Virgo full moon exacts, and the moon will then oppose Neptune, the sun's current ruler, a few hours later. So this latter aspect may create even more confusion about what's real and what's not, and more anger. So again, this complicates the exasperation the Virgo moon feels as it searches for more specificity and exactness from the Pisces sun. This may be especially true since the moon's earthy trine to Pluto in Virgo March 8th creates an easy path toward intense emotions and potentially obsessive ideas, whether they stem from us personally or from others seeking powerful emotional interactions with and or reactions from us now. And this means the Virgo full moon can act as a more powerfully explosive trigger for expressing our anger and frustration at those less forthcoming, primarily because we've waited too long to hear such factual truth from them. Likewise, it may spark anger from those accused of not having been honest or who held back their testimony about situations they may have witnessed firsthand. And here I'm thinking of the brouhaha over the Georgia grand jury forewoman Emily Kors, who I talked about last week, and her newsworthy revelations that several who provided testimony to that grand jury may well actually face indictment in the future. Now, Mars in Gemini squares Neptune, and the monthly lunar cycle's third quarter waning square of the Sagittarius moon to the Pisces sun occur on March 14th. So we're talking a week later from the full moon. And the third quarter square is like the last-ditch effort, actually. The fruit on the vine has been ripe at the new moon, and the third quarter square is we've picked it, or we're dealing with the fact that the crop didn't actually materialize. So I feel like the mutable Mars and Gemini square Neptune and Pisces aspect, which is still waxing at the March 7th lunation, precipitates a recurrence of an ends justifies the means kind of mentality. And this aspect is also present in the U.S. Sibley chart, or birth chart of the United States that many astrologers use. So in that chart, the U.S. has a natal Mars-Neptune square, but from Mars in Gemini to Neptune in Pisces. So this square is from Mars in Gemini to Neptune. I'm sorry, that one is Mars in Gemini to Neptune in Sag, and the one that's occurring now is to Neptune in Pisces. However, anytime an aspect between planets in a chart, not necessarily by sign, just by aspect, occurs in the sky, it prompts what's known as a recurrence of this energy. And given that the United States was founded on a kind of manifest destiny philosophy, which is really basically the no boundaries dream or concept of eternal expansion, and we are, after all, according to the Sibley chart, both a Sagittarius rising and and a Sun, Jupiter, Venus nation square Saturn in Libra, and even charts that disagree with the Sibley chart many of them are within a day or two, and they still have the Sun, Jupiter, Venus conjunction square to Saturn in Libra. That those are in Cancer. I'm sorry, I should have said that. And that kind of energy believes in expansive optimism, which can be achieved by hard work. That's the Saturn square, and that this equals success, but also that we may share our dream with others through partnership. So I want to just look at some of the things that have been said about this Fox News lawsuit that Dominion has filed. And for those of you who don't remember, Dominion is the voting machine company that many crazy people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani have said was, I don't know, connected with Hugo Chavez in Argentina, and that he's, in Chile, I'm sorry, I'm confused. But anyway, we're towards the end of the show, you can fact check that. But that the machinery was involved in switching out votes. Most everybody knows this if they're, anywhere apprised of the news of the last 2 years, basically. But anyway, here's some of the things that people have said. Lies and disinformation breed anger, which I think is perfectly apropos to this upcoming full moon. Disinformation delivers doubt, and doubt deals lack of faith a blow. I think those are all, disinformation, Piscean, doubt, Piscean, Chiron, doubt deals a lack of faith, Jupiter, and then, of course, the lies and disinformation breeding anger is very prevalent in this square to Mars, or this pending square to Mars. Now, I wanted to point out in this particular case that in the media industry, because I worked in trade publishing for about 15 years early in my career, it's well known that there is a wall considered the separation of church and state within that industry, and that concept has been around for a long time to protect the sanctity of journalists' stories from being squashed by management out of fear that readers might flee from the truth and then advertisers might follow. So what we're kind of seeing here is this breach of that with Fox News, which I would say is becoming very prevalent because it's related to the end of Pluto's journey in Capricorn. And it's sort of like showing us capitalism at its worst. So, since Fox News hosts were advocating, like Tucker Carlson, advocating firing of staffers who were fact checkers who told the truth, and the fact that Rupert Murdoch has now been quoted as saying during his grand jury testimony that this isn't red or blue, this is green. And what he meant by that is that he didn't object to people like Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, from espousing all this crazy claims on the Fox News network because he was paying for ads, and so they just let him go on. Now, Fox News knowingly provided false information that fueled an insurrection against the U.S., and that this shatters protections that shield a legitimate news organization. And that's a quote from David Jolly, who's one of the people on MSNBC who's interviewed a lot. He's a former Republican congressman from Florida. But someone mentioned, too, I think it was him, that there is the potential for a post-financial news landscape, which is one in which the Congress creates a set of rules that then creates a sort of medallion that allows a certain percentage of news from a consumer protection angle. The words journalism and news should be ones of integrity. And the history of journalism is that if we did not exist, we'd have corrupt people in power. But that's exactly what happened with Fox. And there a couple of lawyers are saying that usually these kinds of defamation cases settle, but the fact that this case has been remanded by the judge to go to trial shows that how dug in both sides are. So, this will be an interesting thing to watch, obviously. Now, I thought also that in relation to Donald Trump and all these crazy lies that Fox News spread with impunity, it's interesting that I was watching HBO's documentary about January 6th the other night, and I thought it was noteworthy when someone from Cowboys for Trump was interviewed, and he said that he had been at the Capitol on January 6th because he truly believed that Trump was, quote, anointed by God, and that's why he was our president. And I began to think, whoa, wait a minute. Isn't that the concept that's wedded to the notion that kings are divinely anointed by God? And isn't it interesting that we're dealing with the weakening of the monarchy in England as support for King Charles' upcoming coronation has been marred by family infighting? Apparently he's kicked Harry and Meghan out of their old quarters because of Harry's comments in his recently published book, and that he said, some not so nice things about Camilla, the Queen Consort, and, King Charles has decided instead to move in his disgraced brother Andrew. But anyway, that whole concept that the notion that kings and queens are divine consorts, basically, of God in the modern era. And so this republic in the United States was founded on moving away from that notion, right? That everybody should have freedom and everybody's equal, meaning we're equal with the kings and queens. They shouldn't rule us. But then meanwhile, we are experiencing a period of time over the last 5 or 6 years where people have decided that one man or one person is actually the appointed person who was appointed by God. Now, I'm sorry, but that's just effing weird to me. So anyway, I'm out of time. So thank you everyone for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week for another episode of the Karmic Evolution Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go.